now have a panel discussion led by Professor and Dean of Jindal School of International Affairs, Dr. Sriram Cholia. Distinguished members of the panel, Mr. Rajiv Kher, former Commerce Secretary, Mr. Jayant Das Gupta, former Indian Ambassador to the WTO, Professor Jayati Ghosh of JNU, and Mr. Abhijit Das, Head of the Center of WTO. May I request the panel to please proceed to the dais.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, now we are at the business end of the event where we'll actually get into the specifics of the book. My apologies, I had an annotated copy which is maybe got swapped with someone, so I'm just trying to get hold of it because I had some pointers for the discussion referring to specific pages. But I hope we can trace that volume which is around. But we are not lost because we can still take it forward. We have, as you can see, very distinguished panel of people with a lot of experience and understanding of trade issues. One of the points I would like the panel to respond, one of the first things that I observed, and Hardeepji also mentioned, was this power play. And the metaphor I got from reading the book was that essentially WTO and before that the GATT process is a battlefield where there are all kinds of competing interests, aggression, tact, and also a lot of ingenuity to find common ground. So it is clearly, and the phrases that Mohan uses, and I request the panel to reflect on those. Page 17, he talks about brute power being exercised, not just by the United States, but sometimes by the EU and others. On page 47, he says, amazing display of brazenness and brute power by the US and EU in the context of the Uruguay round. Then he has gone into great detail about the Quad, the notorious system of the four top trading powers, setting the agenda and dominating and steering the whole process. Then there is the green room process, which became very notorious. We all resented it in India and in the developing world, that the big boys would huddle in a room beside the WTO head's office and then strike deals and bargains which would then be foisted upon the rest, and they would be willy-nilly coerced into accepting many of the outcomes. So it is a battlefield, and I think he also mentions the iniquity of the whole system. For example, page 117, Mohan, who is quite diplomatic, is in this case very outspoken. He says the WTO's record on providing greater market access for least developed countries or LDCs is, he says, shameful. So clearly the power dynamic is at play. He says the poorest countries often get a raw deal. They have nothing to give back in return in terms of quid pro quos and reciprocity, and therefore they get trampled. The last thing, of course, in the context of the Quad, towards the end of the book, so the beginning of the book, if you read through it, it is indeed a transition. As Hardeepji was saying, once we were defensive about services, now we should be far more offensive about it because our economic structure has changed. But likewise, the WTO system, the negotiating dynamic also, he says, has changed. Initially, he says the Quad was obviously dominant and excluding the rest, but now he says it's been replaced by G5 plus ASEAN plus Japan plus Australia. So in other words, there's an expansion of the elite club. It's no longer limited to just the Quad, the big four, EU, US, Canada, and Japan. So now you have G5, which includes India, China, and Brazil. So my request to the panelists is to reflect on this transition, this journey that Mohan has portrayed. Is it so that the negotiating process has somehow become more democratic and more equitable now, relatively, compared to those bad days of the 80s and 90s when we were all huffing and puffing about the injustice of the whole thing? So has the power play in a way been evened out with more actors? G5 plus ASEAN plus Japan plus Australia is nearly 20 countries he's talking about. And Mohan also mentions that many of the negotiations, the later stages, there are 20 to 25 parties that are actually determining the outcome, no longer just 4. So is that an improvement? And does it help the issue of the LDCs, which still seem to be left out of these top 20? So I'd request panel to reflect on the power dynamics, please. In any order, ma'am, Professor Jayati Ghosh, if you could start. Yeah.
Thank you very much. How long? Just 5 minutes?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, something.
Quick comments.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This has been a fascinating book to read, so thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. And already I think the discussion was quite insightful for somebody who's always been outside this process, looking at the outcomes and trying to figure out how on earth they actually occurred. What is the process that generated these outcomes? So I think the insider's account is very valuable, and the fact that it comes also with that more scholarly attempt to position it is something that is greatly to be valued. I would like to ask 2 different things, okay? I think for me the big takeaway from this book was not really so much about the power dynamics, because let's face it, we know about that. I mean, I don't think you would find anyone in India who doesn't realize that the world is an unequal place, that who you are, which country you are, it matters, that whether it's geopolitics or global economic architecture or any of those things, that power is significant. I think this is very good because it brings out how this works out in the institutional sense, how the processes themselves are kind of weighed in with the power. But for me, the big and most fascinating takeaway, I have to be honest, is the sui generis point, okay? I think it's absolutely true. India is sui generis. But I'm saying, why did we actually allow that to weigh us down so much? Again, I'm saying this on the basis of zero knowledge of how negotiations happen from the inside. I'm just from the outside looking in. But from the outside looking in, one thing that has always struck a lot of people looking at India and the WTO is our inability to make friends, if I may put it bluntly. Why are we always alone? Why are we the holdouts? Why are we in Bali the only ones left standing saying you have to think about food security, when there was a white paper of the G33, saying that these are all essential points? What happened to all of them? Did we alienate everybody? Why in so many of these meetings are we the ones who are seen as opposition, and we don't seem to have any friends, even when these are issues that bother so many developing countries? What is it in our negotiating strategy, which, as I said, I know nothing about it. So my question would be, how come that issues that matter for not just India, but a very large number of other developing countries, we were somehow unable to bring them along with us, even on those issues?
Valid point, ma'am. In fact, Mohan does point out that there have been a number of so-called spoilers or villains who have interrupted or broken or been deal breakers. It's not just India. So although we are often pointed out as the spoilers, so EU, Japan, South Korea, Latin group, even the US, so India gets singled out sometimes. But I think Mohan has also mentioned numerous times when we have been in coalition with like-minded parties and groups. So we've not always been alone, but maybe Ambassador Dasgupta will have a view on this. Sir, are we isolated on trade and often the only one, the sore thumb sticking out, or have we done better?
That's a very interesting question that you have raised. But first of all, I must compliment Mohan on an excellent book. And it was so illuminating. It was very educative for me also, because I was not very familiar with the pre-Doha round history of the WTO. And it could act as a very great source book for people in India and elsewhere who want to look at it, at one place rather than going through tomes about the negotiating history. You have brought it together in one concise piece. Having said that, Professor Jayati Ghosh has brought up a very interesting point about isolation. And I think Mohan alludes to this. And I am reminded of an anecdote. When we were getting into the Seattle meeting, we had a legendary ambassador who since incidentally was supposed to be one of the panelists but couldn't be here, Ambassador S. Narayanan, who was there for about 7 years. He was, as Mohan says in his book, he was the glue kept the like-minded group together of a group of developing countries. And Pakistan, at that point of time, was coordinating very closely with us. It has done so in the WTO on many occasions. And he said, before leaving for Seattle, the Pakistani ambassador told him, we should try to be together as long as possible. That is the issue. And Mohan brings it out very well in his book. There are various kinds of pressures which are used, which are, of course, a manifestation of the power play. Ambassadors are overruled by the capital. Ambassadors get recalled. I remember there was, in the trade facilitation agreement, there was this chargé d'affaires, the acting ambassador of Tanzania, who was supporting India, and he genuinely felt that what we were saying had a lot of sense, and it was true of, for most developing countries, and he was recalled to the capital. The Barbados ambassador in our time, when I was posted in Geneva, she was trying to explain that countries which had a balance of payments problem, they needed assistance to implement many of the trade facilitation texts, recommendations. And she came to me one day and she said that whatever I was doing separately for the small island countries and the Caribbean countries, I'll be unable to lead that advocacy and that proposal which was still being developed. I'll have to give it up because my minister has been spoken to not by the USTR but by the American ambassador in Geneva, and he gave that minister a mouthful, and I got a mouthful from my minister in Barbados, and I have to just drop everything. I'll not be able to do anything in this matter. Now that is, of course, people do realize that power play is something which we see every day, starting from the village panchayat to our state legislatures, to our national legislatures, everywhere. But this is how it operates actually. And the point is, sorry?
Yeah, in fact, Mohan refers to this as two levels, a political level and a technical level.
That's true. And just to, inducement and threats. You will ask the IMF to, turn off the tap. Most of the countries which are our traditional supporters in Africa, in the Caribbean countries, in Asia earlier, they are all, indebted countries, and they all depend on either the EU or the US. So that is something which acts very effectively. The last point I wanted to mention is that there's another anecdote which I am reminded of. There was a meeting in which the US and the EU, and of course there are many developing countries which, instinctively take the side of the US nowadays. And most of them are from Latin America, or 2 or 3 are from Southeast Asia. Even before the US puts up its flag in the WTO, they would put up their flag and they would, read out a statement which perhaps would have been drafted in the US mission in Geneva. Now, what happens is, there are many who have been told not to speak, not to take the floor at all, even though they support us. And that is why I'm reminded of something which was said to me by another ambassador. He said, India speaks for the voiceless in the WTO. There are many considerations which prevent people from speaking up or speaking out. And the last point I wanted to mention is, which Mohan also mentioned very well in his book, that is, and Minister Puri has mentioned that, the small size of the delegations. Through the mid-90s, after the WTO had come into being, we had, I think, 2 officers, the ambassador and 2 officers, and there was 1 section officer. That's it. And even the Brazilians had, I think, 12 people. The Thais had 12, 15 people. So we have not paid enough attention or not given enough care to build up our trade diplomacy and to strengthen whatever analysis we do, including building up the backup support, which we are now, in the past few years, we have been trying to do by building up think tanks and populating them. So,
Thank you, sir. We'll come
Thank
back.
you.
So, one of the points Ambassador just made was about the capacity, trade capacity. And Mohan's book often talks about Brazil and India in tandem. And it appears a lot. And he has recounted an episode where he himself was involved in a deadlock type situation with Celso Amorim of Brazil, and how they came out of that impasse. And he also credits Brazil and India for playing a crucial role in establishing the WTO itself in 1994-95. And a very fascinating insight he has, that he quotes, I quote page 39, the US view is always that if Brazil could somehow be weakened, then India would stand isolated. So that was the other big leg on which the global South position was often articulated. And he says, the collective leadership of Brazil and India, I quote, has the potential to thwart the goals of developed countries. But he has also shown that Brazil also sometimes walked away and did not stick with us. So is it, the opportunism, so Rajiv ji, you've been so involved in all this, your view of the leading developing countries and why, and especially on China, if you could also reflect, because it joined late in 2001, but it's already 17 years now. And has it also made a similar impact? And Mohan has not covered enough of China's role in the negotiating process because the Uruguay and the early millennium round were before China entered. So if you could please reflect on that, and is it just trade capacity or it's also some kind of political will or a mixture of the two, where there's a constituency back home which you have to watch out for before you can negotiate and commit? So can other countries rise up and be leaders for this, give voice to the voiceless, as Ambassador Dasgupta said, apart from us? Can we build a constituency of resistors in this iniquitous system? And is China doing that already?
Well, thank you. Let me begin by first congratulating Mohan for bringing out an excellent account of the history of negotiations as they moved up to the point of Doha initiation. I think it's a great source book for students, whichever institution, whether academics or students like us, and particularly for the people who get into negotiations, because this kind of the kind of information that it contains, and in a very lucid manner, it made the reading so easy that normally and the most important thing, it's perhaps the first account of history of trade negotiations by an Indian. So it brings out the Indian perspective very clearly. Well, having said that, I would respond to a couple of points that you raised. First of all, I don't think I need to respond to this whole issue of transition, because transition is reflected within WTO, outside WTO. This whole spectrum moving from the US dominated, the US power play, to Quad and to the multiple countries that you mentioned, and now we see many more of them. So I don't think that's much of an issue. We understand the manner in which the geopolitics is unfolding, and I think it's very natural that it should be reflected in the WTO also. But you did mention about another point, whether this was good or bad, and you mentioned about the inclusivity dimension of it. I think, WTO is theoretically a democratic organization, and there is no reason, the decision-making is consensus-based, and there is no reason why the entire membership should be involved in the process. Clearly, for 164 people to interact, to express, is not just theoretically impossible, but also there is this whole dynamic of coalition building. And I think that is what has increasingly become more and more pronounced. And India has played a very significant part in that process. I don't know whether LDCs, if they were to be asked, whether they would admit that they have got enough voice in the process. But definitely I am aware that wherever a developing country such as India has taken the lead, LDCs have been able to get their propositions mainstreamed into the overall thought process. But having said that, I also want to respond to the point which Dr. Ghosh made about India's isolation. And she also specifically gave the example of Bali. Well, I think India was never isolated. The problem is the power dynamic, the coercion that is ingrained in the process of trade negotiations. Time and again, as Jayant has given 3 or 4 examples, forget the LDCs, even the developing countries, there are a sizable number who would categorically tell you that they will not speak, but they will support. There are a whole lot of countries, and you mentioned about China. China has very strategically chosen not to speak, but do what they want to do. And the best part about China is that you give them whatever situation and they would comply with that situation, at least visibly. So whether you have actual trading across borders or whether you have a diplomatic parley between various members, China would rarely ever come against a proposition which has been, which is engaging attention of the membership. It's only lately that you notice that China is now visibly trying to take a certain leadership position in the WTO. And that is again a reflection of the aggression that China is showing of late. So, it's a question of different strategies that the 2 countries adopt. In the case of India, we have been visibly seen as people fighting more for in-principle based decisions, and we have been happy about taking leadership of the developing community. Now, many times, and I have been privy to these discussions from the highest levels, that why do we take a position which is supportive of a LDC or a developing country where we may not have enough interest? This has been put forth to us, and we have always said, and the point which earlier speakers have brought in, that India exists in a multi-layered situation. You have every situation that exists anywhere in the world which exists in India. And therefore, at a given point in time, you can never take a unilateral position. You can never take a position which expresses India in one proposition. You have to keep yourself prepared to take help from different groups of countries who would be representing a position which you may have to take at some point in time. It could be extremely depressed position when you're talking of subsidies. It could be entirely a different position when you're talking of e-commerce. So clearly, because you are taking multiple positions at multiple occasions, therefore you have to build these coalitions, and therefore you have to willy-nilly rely on the entire membership. So I think this whole issue of isolation is completely, yes, we begin with isolation. In Bali, we began with isolation. But as it went along, and even in Bali, we were able to cobble a coalition which was clearly 47 numbers we counted. And of course, there was a whole process in that. We started with 3 and we went up to 47. So I think we perhaps have not been adequately able to express the manner in which we build these coalitions. And I think this book is a great contribution to
articulation, sir. Ma'am, you can have a rejoinder on that, but I want to bring in Professor Abhijit Das also. Professor Das, Mohan in the book often talks about what leads to logjam and stalling of these negotiating rounds. And as you know, it is now 17 years since Doha started and we are still not concluded. And he blames primarily what he calls the mercantilist negotiating approach and attitude of developed countries. And now my question is, you think, I mean, he's talking about a pre-Trump era. And now it seems that they're even more mercantilist in terms of asserting that, more market access and, closing their borders, protectionism. So now you have reached a stage where I think this is like the apotheosis of mercantilism coming from the West. So some people think that's going to destabilize the WTO itself because Trump is attacking it. But on the other hand, it's a continuity of the same idea that trade is good but imports are bad. So do you think, is that one reason for us to be pessimistic? Hardeep ji said that, and Mohan said that the WTO will reinvent itself. But in your view, the current anti-globalization wave, To what extent, and this neo-mercantilism, to what extent is it going to prolong this logjam, and what extent could it completely undermine the multilateral system?
Thank you. At the outset, let me heartily compliment Ambassador Mohan Kumar for a fabulously eminently readable book. I read it at one go and I really benefited from it. So it's not a mere historical account, as you claim it is. It goes well beyond that. It has gems of insights, which certainly Commerce Ministry officials, particularly those in the Trade Policy Division, as well as other parts of the government, would immensely benefit from. At one stage in the book, you give a very modest statement that you rarely thought civil society organizations could, in a way, teach negotiators anything. But then in the course of the TRIPS public health negotiation, you realize the immense expertise which they have. I think that's a realization which needs to sink in the government at large when it comes to trade negotiations. So that's a very, very valid point which you made. And there are similar gems scattered all over the book. So compliments to you once again for a fabulous book. It's not only history, it is much, much more insightful than mere history. Coming to the questions which Professor Sriram Cholia has raised, let's have no illusions. The developed countries have always been mercantilistic. Trump is being unfairly blamed, if I can say that. I do not want to sound like a supporter of Trump. But what Trump is doing is absolutely no different from what his predecessors did, at least as far as trade goes. Let me go back to the 1982 ministerial. We heard about power play. Let me recount one incident which I have read about the ministerial. Brazil and India were opposing services getting into the GATT negotiating framework. So towards the last few hours of the negotiation, the USTR walks in and says, who in the Brazilian delegation is opposing services negotiation? Please identify yourself, I'll get you transferred out within 5 minutes. Wow. It was India which stood up to prevent the situation from deteriorating further. So that is the type of power play which goes on over there. And in the context of that power play, we do need to admire someone called Murasoli Maran. He's a long forgotten person, but the way he handled the power play in Doha was just fascinating. So sir, when you write your second book, I'm sure Sumanto over there, he'll be able to provide some very, very interesting anecdotes on how the domestic environment was created to make sure that the international power play, it exists, but the impact is lessened. Coming to the other part of your question on logjams, I'm afraid the diffusion of global political and economic power which we are seeing, and with many more countries on the negotiating table, that in all likelihood is unlikely to remove the logjam for a very simple reason. If you look at the distribution of economic powers amongst countries which were the main decision makers in the GATT era and the earlier years of WTO, it was the Quad. Their GDP was almost similar, per capita GDP was almost similar. But now it's very different. You have countries with, okay, a bit variation in GDP, but huge variation in per capita GDP. India's per capita GDP would be perhaps 1/30th of United States. So the convergence in economic interests of countries which were at the high table of negotiations, that convergence is no longer there. And it's not possible. So the countries at the high table of negotiations are likely to pursue very different objectives, and that is going to make striking deals extremely difficult.
So getting to know is going to be easier. Let me do another round, but quicker and a shorter one in the interest of time. Professor Ghosh, you can respond to the isolation one, but also one question about the role of big businesses and multinational corporations. Mohan has raised this about how the Americans pioneered this and brought in, the CEOs of major corporations and which are actually part of delegation and pushing these. So to what extent has a national interest of a delegation been determined by corporate lobbying at home? And in what way is that, and has it gone beyond the US? I mean, you expect that in advanced capitalist countries like the US, but would you say that even in India and elsewhere, that we now have more and more inputs from chambers and corporate houses, and are those actually our reflecting our talking points and our negotiating points, or is there something else? Like some of the panel said, we have public interest, 600 million farmer, that kind of thing, or is it also reflecting naked commercial interests being projected as national interests? Your view on this, please.
Well, this is a very complex thing. I think there are always all these interests in these negotiations, and it is definitely the case that corporate lobbying plays a very important role, not just in the United States, but in countries like India as well. I've had negotiators when the India-Thailand negotiations, the trade agreement was being negotiated. I had negotiators in Thailand telling me how shocked they were to discover India demanding exactly the same powers for investment protection that they were used to getting from the US when they were negotiating with the US. So yes, these things happen, right? And there's always an internal political economy dynamic. So it could be whether you're trying to ensure certain crops are more protected because that's a politically sensitive state, or whether you're trying to look at particular industries because for whatever reason you want those sectors or those capitalists to have a better deal. All of that definitely plays a role. I don't think we should necessarily be surprised at that. I think the challenge for us today is not just that. I mean, that happens in domestic policy making just as much as it happens in negotiation. And I'm sorry, I will be brief. Unfortunately, I have to leave because there's a flight that has to be caught. But I want to just ask a slightly different question at this point, which is, I think this is a fascinating book, but I have a different request for your second book, which is based on the multilateral experience, how are we going to cope with an increasingly bilateral world, where basically it's the United States and a bunch of other big guys have decided they're going to take everyone on individually. And let's face it,
institutions are being weakened, yeah?
It's not just that the multilateral institutions are being weakened, but that they're often also being twisted to operate in favor of, and we're used to the United States ruling the roost, but I think we are now going to face this with the European Union in a much more bilateral way, with China in a much more bilateral way. Yeah. And perhaps the negotiating stances then have to be different. How do we handle a world which is no longer so multilateral? And we cannot pretend that it's going to remain very multilateral.
At least until the next US election.
I don't think, I agree, I'm sorry, I agree that that it's not just Trump. Trump is a little less hypocritical. I mean, he's orange and all that, but he's also less hypocritical.
Rajivji, any other thoughts you want on the book that you want the audience to know? Anything else?
I'm really sorry to rush off. Please do forgive me.
Please,
and I don't.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Anything else you feel Mohan should have covered, has not come in the book, or which you feel?
Well, should have covered, I think he has covered everything. One small thing, because of course your book covers up to a point, and I would have loved to see a little more on coalition building and how India played in it. Of course, you covered in Uruguay and Seattle. Till that point, it was very well done. After Doha, I think the manner in which coalition evolved further, I think that could have been, maybe you could have expanded on that. But having said that, I just addressing this whole issue of corporate interest.
Yes.
I am not surprised about, this is something which is very often said, that there is a corporate agenda behind the international agenda. Why do we say that? Because ultimately, this is only in India that a business interest and national interest unnecessarily gets, a personal business interest is a different thing. But a business working in an Indian economic setting is essentially contributing to the national economic agenda. So why do we try to make unnecessarily a discourse more moralistic than it is required to be?
Fair enough, sir. In the Jindal group also believes that we are contributing to the national development of this country and the national interests. We have maybe 5 more minutes, but Ambassador Dasgupta, any thoughts on the book, sir? Anything further? What about the future, sir? How about Professor Ghosh's point that maybe we have to change our tactics and strategy to adapt to this one-on-one thing which is emerging as more, or even the small preferential agreements as opposed to broad, large group agreements. Are we ready for it, prepared for it diplomatically, and or we need to update ourselves with something new, a new approach?
Before I address those questions, I wanted to mention two things. One is that in Bali, I forgot to mention the debt of gratitude that India owes to the South African Minister Rob Davies, and the other African countries who stood like a rock by us and told the US and the Director General of the WTO that there would be no agreement if this concern of food security, which also affected a large number of other countries, was addressed in full. And we cannot forget that moment. And that is what tilted the balance. And India, of course, had a lot of silent supporters, but this very strong, emphatic statement, it tilted the balance, and then the US was forced to see reason. The point that I wanted to make, which is little known now and not remembered as much, the US, had a problem with exporting beef, hormone-fed cattle, exporting to the EU. And the EU put bans on the import of hormone-fed beef in 1989. And the US applied tariffs on $100 billion worth of, or euros worth of exports from the EU to the US. And that is what Mohan brings out in his book. Doesn't it remind you of what Trump is actually doing to China now? It is, in a sense.
Billion, yeah.
The second point I wanted to mention is, lesser known fact about the appellate body getting stymied and stalled, in terms of getting new people on board. This process didn't start with Trump. It started with Obama. And Obama had also, his ambassador had also stalled new nominations to the appellate body after a while. And there were various conditions which they put, and Mohan has addressed some of them in his suggestions. So that is there. Now, addressing the questions that you put, I think with negotiations at the WTO and then a succession of FTA negotiations starting from the late 90s, SAPTA, then SAFTA, ASEAN, etc. I think we have a body of negotiators, and we have good backup in terms of the research and analysis that needs to go into a stand that we take on all areas. But one of the problems that we still face is the unorganized nature of our businesses. When you talk of the Coalition of Services Industries in the US or the American, Agriculture Bureau of the National Alliance of Manufacturers in the US, which all descended incidentally in July 2008 and told the USTR that she couldn't negotiate in closing the Doha deal because they were not getting enough. That is also mentioned in Paul Bluestein's book, which you have quoted on at several points. So we don't have that kind of, an integration of our industries so that the smallest industry in one corner of India, maybe in a cluster, gets its voice heard in the industry associations. And no offense meant to Manab and the CII representatives, but this is a fact of life. And the other point which I wanted to make is that when you ask for an offensive interest, and when we had meetings in 2006, 7, etc., when we were negotiating, trying to close the Doha round in services, there was hardly anybody who would come up and say, this is what we want in this sector. We were very unidimensional. And even if you look at it now, it is mode 4. Mode 1 is almost open for India. Mode 2 is basically about tourism and health tourism, education tourism. We are trying to address that. That's it. Mode 4 is what we are trying to push. We have been trying to push it for more than 20 years. It accounts for only about 3% of global trade in services. It is mode 3. And mode 3 calls for deep pockets. It calls for an attitude of investing and the ability to invest in commercial enterprises abroad. How many of our companies in services sector are actually trying to do that? That will provide the impetus for us to demand things. Thank you.
Sir. Outward FDI is growing, so hopefully
Yes.
that will add to that. Last comments to Professor Das. Mohan Kumar has projected India as a kind of a plucky, weak but dynamic negotiator and participant in the whole process, punching above its weight, he said consistently. Do you agree with the view, or you think we lack something that would make us more successful?
I would fully endorse the views of Ambassador Mohan Kumar expressed in the book. It's quite correct that India always has been punching above its weight. Of course, there was a time when maybe just after the WTO was established, when the situation was very demoralizing for India, and it was really the efforts of Ambassador Mohan Kumar and Ambassador Narayanan that we could regroup through this like-minded group on the implementation issues. So India has been fairly nimble and it has punched above its weight. But I just wanted to go back on the question which you asked me in the last round. What about the future? Yeah. Let me do a bit of crystal ball gazing. What we are seeing now is not very different from what was being witnessed in the context of negotiations on TRIPS agreement. Brazil, India were absolutely recalcitrant. What did the US do? It really turned on the pressure on these countries through direct economic threats. That is what we are likely to see in the near future as well. After having kept WTO in almost a paralyzed situation, US is certainly going to do its best through fair or foul means to make sure that big developing countries like India, Brazil, Argentina, Indonesia, etc., they fall in line with its wishes. If these countries are not able to defend their interests, which will certainly be very hard, we will see absolutely one-sided bilateral agreements between these countries and US. And once these one-sided bilateral agreements have been cobbled together, for the sake of efficiency, these one-sided agreements will perhaps in some manner be brought together at the WTO or a similar other institution. So what we are seeing is not a demise of WTO, but absolutely partly orchestrated, but certainly a very planned paralysis, so that the new organization or the new incarnation of WTO which emerges will be much more in tune, much more in line with the interests of the developed world.
But that presumably would be inverse to the power balance that is shifting more in a multipolar direction, and whether they can sustain it, I hope the prognosis is wrong, and that there will be balance in the system. And surely already the way the Chinese seem to be hitting back at the Americans, it doesn't look like the Americans will be able to reshape it anew as per their whim and fancy. But still, we must study these, and of course we are cognizant of these. So please, we will try to get an Indian imprint which is $5.99 or $6.99 soon, and you will all be notified. We will put out a press release from the university and hopefully from RIS side, and it will be widely disseminated and discussed. Let's celebrate this book, and thank you to all the esteemed panelists for sharing. I think it was a very high-powered panel which gave a lot of insight, and we are recording it, and we hope we can put it up online as well for those who missed it, because this looks like we actually had a good current affairs discussion on the state of global trade itself. Thanks all to Mohan Kumar's scholarship. So congratulations, Mohan. Thank you all for being here. I request the Vice Chancellor to please honor the panelists for their wisdom and time and energy.